Hi, my name is Jessica Stokes, and I'm a graduate of St. John Fisher College. I'm here today with Jack Palvino on another installment of the Rochester Radio Archive. Jack was in the pioneer class of St. John Fisher, was a part owner of WVOR, WHAM, and WHTK, and he is the namesake of the Jack Palvino Communication Journalism Hall of Fame. Thank you for coming in.
You're welcome. Nice to be here.
My first question is, what made you decide that you would want to go into radio?
Well, I never liked to work. So rather than have a job I didn't like, actually my parents wanted me to become an attorney. So after graduating from Fisher, I was in the first class here, a little earlier than you, in 1955. I went to the University of Buffalo Law School and was totally disenamored with the law. Meantime, I had been working part-time to make ends meet as a DJ, and I decided this is what I like to do, and this is what turns me on. So, at the chagrin of my total family and parents, I left law school and came back to Rochester and started work as a DJ at WSAY, which was the starting ground at that time for all announcers locally. And they gave us phony names because it was the feeling of the owner that if the announcer left and the name stayed the same, the audience would never know the difference. So I was Jerry Jack.
Did it work? Did they
No.
know?
On the same day, I would be, hi, this is Jerry Jack. It's 9 o'clock. Then the shifts change at 9. So I would then say, hello, it's 9:01. This is Mac McGuire. That was the late Gordon Brown. And the only names we could use were Jerry Jack, Mac McGuire, Terry Toombs, Tommy Thomas. He was into alliteration. So starting there, though, was the springboard that enabled us to get into broadcasting. So most of Rochester radio and TV people started at WSAY, and I loved it. We started at 67 cents an hour, no pay for overtime. And I always had loved radio. And since then, I have preached that if you love what you do, you never have to work a day in your life. I feel as though I've never worked a day in my life. I loved radio. I still love radio. And I tell my children and grandchildren to follow their dreams for the same reason. And I believe everyone should if they can. The key is to make it profitable enough to earn your way through life. But when you love what you do, nothing is work. And so as a result, you become very proficient and very valuable to your employer or yourself if you're self-employed. So I was very fortunate to find what I loved and spend a lifetime doing it.
Where did you go after WSAY?
After WSAY, I headed south to Geneva, New York, on the shores of Seneca Lake. I see these pictures on the wall here include some old friends of mine, not only Uncle Eddie Meath, but below that, Arthur Godfrey and Jack Friel. Jack Friel, the late Jack Friel, was an announcer at WHEC. And he said, Jack, there's an opening at WGVA in Geneva. If you're interested, I hear you may have a few problems. And the problems he's referring to were a friend of mine is a fellow announcer, and his name is Gary Smith. His brother was Todd Smith, who was my engineer at WSAY. We're baseball fans. During the World Series, Todd said, you know, if we put this show on tape and you just say it's 10 after the hour, 20 after the hour, we could put the tape on and we can go down the road to the Pittsford Inn and have a beer and watch the World Series. And I said, Todd, I don't know, this might be a little testy. He said, no, we could do this. So he picked up a tape. It was a 2-hour tape. And I said, Todd, you're not coming with me. He said, oh, yeah. He said, No one will notice. So he recorded our music show, and I said 10 after the hour, sunny, the forecast, the whole deal. And he said, we're headed out. So it was an afternoon game, and we went down to Pittsford and enjoyed the Yankees and the Minnesota Twins. And we didn't realize that in that 2-hour window, the owner of the station decided to visit the station and found that there was no one there and the tape was spinning. He had no one to yell at, but when we returned, he did have someone to yell at. So Jack had heard about this little incident. It said, I heard you might be looking. And so we headed south for Geneva. And we were privileged to enjoy a meeting with a friend of mine, Mike Casella, great voice, fellow Fisher guy, and he graduated the year after I did, and a booming voice. And GVA was a farm system of WBBF in Rochester. So they would send rookie announcers first to Utica, New York, where my friend used to say elephants go to die. That they're not that bad, but if you proceeded from Utica, you would advance to Geneva. If you proved yourself in Geneva, they would promote you to WBBF, which at one time was the most popular radio station in the country, pro rata, highest ratings of any station in the whole country, an amazing radio station. Maury Foreman owned the station. He used to own Foreman Clothing Company, beautiful ladies' clothes. Matter of fact, when I interviewed him on my program later in life, President Carter, his wife was so enamored that she never showed up for the interview but went to Foreman's to shop for ladies' clothes with our lady receptionist at the time. I'll never forget that. But Bob Keeve, who is one of my gurus in broadcasting and is still working at age 90 in San Jose, California, running a country station which is top 3 in the marketplace, said, Jack, we're going to send you and Mike to Geneva, and we want you to cover the day. Well, that meant it was us. It was a daytime operation. So I would do mornings, Mike would do 9 to 12, and then I would come back 12 to 3, and then Mike would take it from 3 to sign off. So that's what happened. And I said, I hope we can leave Geneva soon, although I love Geneva, to advance to our home, which is Rochester. So after a couple of years, we came to WBBF. We were promoted to WBBF Rochester. This was in 1960. And in 1960 was a very important year because on the 8th of October, I was to be married. And on the 9th and 10th of October, I was to be breaking in to take over the morning show on WBBF because the previous morning show host, Jerry Fogel, had decided to take a shot at Hollywood and went on to star in a couple of series, My Mother the Car, and a couple of those TV series out in Hollywood. So there was an opening for a morning man at WBBF. And at the time, the legendary lineup had such incredible ratings. It was amazing because there was no internet. There barely was TV, black and white TV. So radio was everything. Mm-hmm. It no longer is, but it was at that time. And so we were connected at the perfect time, in my mind, in the history of Rochester to be a successful radio station. Joe Dean, Nick Nixon, Leon Marguerite, biggest man in nighttime radio, used to weigh 300 pounds and eat a Philadelphia sub every night. Before he went on the air, whole place smelled like onions. Bill DeMars, man of 1,000 voices all night. BBF, which was 95 on the AM dial, and which you couldn't hear on a windy day in Canandaigua because the signal was only 1,000 watts compared to someone like Wham, which is 50,000 watts, dominated this whole market because rock and roll was just beginning. And I remember it well, playing Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock and the Elvis Presley and then the Beatles and so on. And that music, I can remember driving into Don Kolznick's Sunoco on Monroe Avenue and paying a lot less for gas than we do now. But him saying, "Oh, you don't think this rock and roll music will last this? You're not going to pin your board on this junk, are you?" And here we are, how many years later, and rock and roll, and especially the 50s, the most memorable era in musical history. So I was very fortunate to be able to be at the apex of an industry when I was on the air mornings. And I was blessed to have with me one of the most talented guys I've ever known, my engineer, the late Don Ariano, who single-handedly kept Genesee Brewery in business, but also was a guy who had a great sense of humor. He was a funny guy. And he liked to tape things. So one morning, he started throwing voices at me, which he had taped, and I knew nothing about. So when I came to work at 6 in the morning, I would never know what he was going to throw at me in the way of a voice. It could be a president, it could be Bill Cosby, it could be anybody else. And he was like a person who was a ventriloquist, but he talked through other people's voices. And it kept me on my toes because I don't want to sound like a klutz. And so I had to really be sharp with him. Well, it worked. The ratings were sky high. And every time we would get a consultant that would come in, a radio consultant, they say, "Oh, it'll never work. You got to stop doing this." So we'd stop. And the ratings would go down. They said, "Well, we better bring those back now." And they came back. And this happened 2 or 3 times. Finally, they said, "Okay, forget about it. Do the voices." So Don and I did that for 20 years. And we were fortunate enough to be at the top of the pile. So I was always very pleased to do that.
What happened? So you were with WBBF for 20 years?
Yes.
And what did you do after that?
Well, it's hard to be a teenage idol when you're in your 40s. And in 1978, I ran into a friend of mine. My old manager from BBF, Bob Keeve, had left to go to San Jose, California, where he still is. He's the 90-year-old gentleman I refer to. And he said, "I'd like to have you come out with me in San Jose." And I had just been married and had children. And I said, "I don't want to bring up my family in California. I'd rather bring them up in Rochester." So he said, "Well, all right, why don't you start looking for a station in Rochester and we'll be partners." So I did. Started looking through brokers and seeing what stations might be available. And one of the stations we approached to buy for Bob was WVOR, owned by the Wertheimer family. And as I began to talk to Bud Wertheimer and his dad, Big Al, it became clear that we had a chemistry between us. And we really hit it off. So negotiating to purchase the station for my friend Bob, Bud said, "Look, why don't you and I form a company and we'll be partners." He is a brilliant guy, Dartmouth grad, engineer, a huge financial expert, and I would handle the programming and sales. Well, in 1978, we got together, we formed the Lincoln Group and purchased WVOR from his dad, basically. And at the time, it was rated number 15 in a market of 13 stations. I think we had 1 or 2 listeners, and that was about it. It was a burned down transmitter, third floor of Midtown Tower, and we had staff of 3.
Who was your third person?
Our third person was a true character who was named Bill Klein. Bill Klein had been employed by my partner's father as a handyman and handling account receivables along with being everything in the station. When you're a small operation, you do everything. He was a true character. I write about him in my book, On the Air. And Bill Klein is one of the biggest characters I have ever met in my life. One story. He used to collect our accounts receivable, people who owed us money. So when he would talk to the people, he would get so absorbed into their story that he would feel sorry for them, and he would end up loaning the money. So we had to change his job description immediately. So that was our third employee. So we had startup, and after a while we were very successful at WVOR. In 1978 we were at the bottom. And by 1982, we had, as our third stockholder, had welcomed the best salesperson I'd ever met, named Ed Musicus. And we brought him over from WBBF as well. He's one of these guys who never missed a quota in his years with us in sales, and just a brilliant salesperson. So we were the 3 stockholders, Bud, Eddie, and myself. And in 1982, we suddenly rose up to higher in the ratings. One of the reasons was we hired a guy named Dick Tobias, who was a noted Rochester figure, very, very controversial, great voice, and another character, real character, but someone who people would listen to no matter what. And he wanted $50,000 a year to join us. So I said, Eddie, we can't afford $50,000. He said, Jack, you hire him, I'll sell him. So we hired him. And as soon as we did that, Eddie did go out, as usually did, he hit his target. And he sold enough sponsors to bring Dick over to pay his salary. We put him on the air on FM, which had been a music-centered format before this. And we consciously went after WHAM as an information station on the FM dial, as opposed to AM, which was dominant at that time. Although FM has a better signal. Still does and always will. Well, as soon as we brought Dick aboard, put on a helicopter, and starting doing information in the morning, I had to do mornings because we couldn't afford to hire a morning man. No choice. So that was an easy decision to make. And so we were very fortunate that WHAM had a very loose format at the time. And we took over information on the FM side and rose to the top of the ratings, and our billings went up. Things started to go well. So well that we started to expand and purchased a station in Buffalo, WBUF. And we were there for about 7 or 8 years as well. And then WHAM became available. So the very station that we had knocked down to beat them in the beginning, we had to buy again. We bought it in 1986 and built up the station we had knocked down before and brought back news and information to WHAM. And that was a privilege. For the next 10 years, we owned WHAM. In the meantime, we had purchased WPXY, AM and FM, WHFM, and a country station in Ohio, Salem, Ohio, which was a wonderful little radio station. WQRX, and country is a wonderful format. It still is today. You know, the stories are great. The long neck bottle get out of my hand and all this. But it's just a wonderful format. So at the end, we had 7 stations. which had formed the Lincoln Group. And when we started Wham, we were the third station in the country to hire Rush Limbaugh. Cost us $5,000 a year. So we had a reception at the Eastman Theater and at the Rochester Club. If you pay $100, you can meet Rush. So Rush came in. Well, we started having cocktails, and no one could find Rush. He's hiding behind the door. Believe it or not, Rush at that time was so shy, he was afraid to meet people. So we had to pull him out and say, look, these people are paying $100. We'll be on each side of you. So don't be worried. Come out and shake hands. And he finally did. And that's the Rush Limbaugh that no one will recognize. I tell you, today, people don't believe the story, but it's a true story. He was so shy in Rochester, we couldn't bring him out. So that was the beginning of Wham, and we had a wonderful run with Wham. They had been playing music. We did a focus group and said, what do you want to hear on Wham? And overwhelmingly, people said, we want news and information. So we killed the music. We brought back news. We brought back information. We brought back the Buffalo Bills. And within 3 years, we had Wham back up in the #1 spot, where it stayed, I must say, until we sold it in 1996. So we were very privileged to have ownership of that station because it's a legend. It was the #3 station in the entire country when it was put on the air back in the 20s. And it was one of only 3 50,000 watt clear channel stations at the time, so no one else would be on that frequency. And we used to be able to hear it in Montreal or Florida. In fact, one time we were on a cruise in London and we were getting on the ship. I turned my radio on because AM skips off the ionosphere and comes down. The signal goes up and comes down, whereas FM is a direct line of sight. You never know where it's going to come down. I heard Wham. I was listening to what's happening on State Street in London. This is before computers.
That's pretty crazy.
Yeah, and it was a wonderful station. We purchased it from Bill Rust, who was a great engineer, and it was just a pleasure to own. That one, of all the stations we owned, is the one I miss most because it was such an outstanding station. Pictures with Babe Ruth at the Wham, microphone, Walter Winchell, every president who was, and a pleasure to own that station. Pleasure to own all of them.
How come you sold them?
Money. The right time at the right price and the right place. The reason we sold them was a new law which came out in 1996 allowing radio station operators to purchase more than 2 stations in a market. Before that, you couldn't have more than 2. Now, this new law, which came out and was passed, we were the first case that was tested by this law. The rule as to how many stations you could own was determined by your ratings. So as to avoid a monopoly, they didn't want the number of listeners to be like 78% of the listeners. Well, that's not fair because of the antitrust laws. So they had to weigh what our percentage of listeners was, and then they said, okay, you own VOR, you own PXY, you can buy WHAM under this new law. This is an opportunity that we couldn't pass up. We knew it. And right now, I couldn't be more sure of it looking back. We did the right thing. Although both personally, both Bud and I and Eddie too, the 3 stockholders, we all love and miss radio. But we did sell it at the right time and at the right price. So that's why we sold Wham.
How had radio changed from when you first bought the stations to when you sold them?
To when we sold them, it had been totally personality before we purchased them. I mean, the legendary people in Rochester, the Eddie Meaths of this world, Uncle Eddie Meath, everyone would listen to him when I was a youngster in town. He was the morning man that everyone listened to. There was a get dressed contest between boys and girls. Well, the boys win with 3 buttons this morning. Well, everybody in Rochester was doing a best dress, who won, and they talk about that. You go way back to some of the people in this town. Al Siegel was one of the first announcers in Rochester in radio that everyone listened to. Worst voice in history. Nasal twang, this is Al Siegel. And he would read the obituaries, and he would be top rated at noon every day on WHEC. And the same thing happened to us in Salem in our country station. Our top rated program at 7 in the morning was a lady reading obituaries. So that's how radio changed. It was personalities when we bought it. It became less personalities, unfortunately, by the time we sold it, and automation started to creep in. At one point, there was a WEZO station in Rochester, easy listening, a machine in a room. That was it. And it played soft music to be behind you. Well, that started to creep in then. This is in the 80s and 90s. Unfortunately, what's happened since then is it's continued on that road. And now there are fewer personalities, and I think that's what's been the death of the media, to be honest with you. And there are more and more automated large conglomerates that use voice tracks from all over the country with announcers in Chicago airing their voice in Rochester and New York. And anybody can let people think they are in any market. Just give the temperature and say it's cloudy today, they think you're there. So you have more and more of these voice tracks going on, and fewer real personalities, some of which you can't stand, but the people should be able to decide who wins. That's the way it should be in broadcasting. And that's the biggest change that I saw.
So after you've retired, you did the Chats with Jack?
Yes.
What is that?
Well, I always wanted to help the young Fisher communication journalism students to be able to do what they really wanted to do. And so I came back when we were at VOR. We started something with it's called the Heart of Gold Charitable Foundation, which helped those needs not covered by any other charity on a one-time only basis. In fact, Danny Guilfoyle's the head of that now, and I'm happy he is. And we did very well helping it. And one of the things we did was set up a scholarship fund for Fisher students in need, about $1,000 a year for 2 scholarships. And so we started meeting these students, and I got to like them. And so I found that most of them didn't really think of precisely what they wanted to do. So I used to come in, and I must have talked to a couple hundred at least, students, in the way I'm talking with you, one-on-one basis in a room. What is it you like in life? Why are you going to school? And what do you want to do the rest of your life? And I really got into knowing what they wanted to do. And where I could, I helped them. If they said I wanted to be on radio, I'd call one of my friends on radio and say, hire this little girl or this little guy, whatever, as an intern, and see if you really like it. If you want to go to the paper, let's call the paper and see if we can get you in there. But it kind of focused them into reality. It was one of the most gratifying things I've ever done, to be able to help young students and a lot of them have been successful. I mean, we've had people, there are a couple of them right now who have done very well. Fisher grads and non-Fisher grads who've started in areas they never even knew about. So that's what I did.
How did the Jack Palvino Hall of Fame begin?
Well, that started in assisting those who had contributed to the school after leaving the school, which all good graduates should do. When we were in operational mode in the 90s, we had a wonderful group of managers and owners called the Rochester Radio Broadcasters Association. At that time, we all got along. It was before the 1996 legislation, the Communications Act I mentioned to you, came into effect. So there were about a dozen managers, all different stations. And we used to trade our billing figures and things of that nature and help radio in ways that we could to succeed. We were competitors, but we were friendly competitors. One of the things we did was set up a Hall of Fame for people who deserved to be in the Rochester Radio Broadcasters Hall of Fame. Unfortunately, when the big conglomerates got together and purchased most of the stations, there are about 3 companies that own all the stations now, that Rochester Radio Broadcasters Association died because the people didn't like each other as much and they were much more competitive. And so the result was that the Hall of Fame kind of phased down a little bit too. But that was the origin of it. We tried to continue it, I think, until about 2000 or 2001. After that, it kind of petered out. But that's how it started.
What do you see? You saw how radio changed when you owned it. How do you see radio changing in 10 years?
Well, I think it will be an increasing specialization and niche development. There's so many different platforms where people get the information that they used to get solely from radio. Whether it's computer, an iPhone, a smartphone, an iPad, it's a different ball game now. And I don't see radio being a general store, which it used to be. In the 50s and 60s, when radio was at its peak, all the information that the people in that kitchen heard about came from the radio speaker in the morning. There wasn't even TV, barely TV. It was just developing, to say nothing of the internet. So unfortunately, I think there'll be a contraction of radio, going to different types of radio, like the Sirius XM situation, where I thought I had seen as much narrowcasting as I could see in my lifetime. Sports radio, classical music, which I now listen to, believe it or not, and other business formats and things of that nature. But the narrowcasting has gotten even narrower, and I think it's going to increase to get narrower. And I see over-the-air broadcasting as being replaced by the internet more. That's the way I see it developing in the future.
So with that being said, what advice do you have for someone who wants to get into radio?
I was afraid you're going to ask me that question. We talked about that at lunch today with Annie and Lauren, and I still have to say, although I don't think the radio business per se is as lucrative as it once was, that if it is something you truly love, you should pursue it. I recall one young lady who, in one of my chats, came in and said, what I really would like to do I said, no. She said, I'd like to be a country and western singer. So I called a couple of my friends in the music business in Nashville and got her an internship down there. And she succeeded in becoming a successful country and western singer. And I think that the same is true in radio. Although I think the radio I knew and the radio of the future are two different things. And unless it returns to its roots, won't ever be as big as it once was. So that's my feeling.
Is there anything else you wanted to add?
No, only thing I would like to say is I'm happy to be in with you today and with my alma mater. And I couldn't be more proud of St. John Fisher and the graduates that we have been able to send to our community and to the country all over the world. And in the communication journalism department, for a station, for a college which started out, which in 1955 graduated 57 of us, and they're only guys. The impact that this college has had is overwhelming, and it still amazes me today. And I still encourage all the graduates, no matter what they're doing, to love what you do. That's the whole key to a happy life, in addition to a happy wife. So if more people would do that, I think we would have fewer problems.
Well, thank you for coming in. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Nice to talk with you.